Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over interest groups and the mass media. So let's go right into the material here. In today's lecture, we're going to identify the different functions of interest groups. So what exactly do these interest groups do? We're going to discuss the various types of interest groups. We're going to review different strategies that interest groups employ. So what are ways that interest groups can infiltrate the government to try to get their message across? What are the best ways to do that? And then we're going to explain the importance of one particular court decision that is, again, depending on what textbook you're using for this class. If you have an older version, you're not going to get this court case. So this is very important to review. It's the importance of the Citizens United versus FEC decision. So it does impact and it does change the way that PACs are actually used in today's election cycle. And then we're going to differentiate between PACs and super PACs. Again, kind of a recent phenomenon, a super PAC. So make sure you particularly pay attention to that. We're going to explain the role of the media as a linkage institution. That terminology is popular that the AP likes to throw around, a linkage institution. What is something that links the people to the government? So the media plays that role. And then we're going to examine the role of the media as a gatekeeper and a watchdog. So what are the functions of an interest group? If you go back to kind of the beginning, the Federalist Papers, James Madison, he warned of factions, but he was opposed to eliminating them, just moderating their effect through separation of powers. Now, we talked about factions before in the context of a political party. So it really is kind of your opinion as to whether or not interest groups are factions or whether or not political parties are factions, or possibly both. But it's this idea that when you look at interest groups, they're not really looking at the interests of the country as a whole. They're looking at narrow self-interest. And I think we can all agree that Madison said that trying to eliminate factions altogether, or interest groups or political parties, that would be counterproductive. So Madison basically acknowledged the existence of factions, and the current manifestation. He acknowledged that there would be interest groups, and eliminating them would be maybe worse than the cure. But basically, the system of government that we have it moderates the influence. It limits the influence by separating the powers of government. And so we're going to examine, what do interest groups actually do? And so again, they might get a bad rap in the public, but they're not all that bad. Interest groups as a whole, they raise awareness and stimulate interest in public affairs by educating members, the public, and even Congress. Now keep in mind, congressmen, they're not superhumans. Most of them, the plurality of them are actually trained as lawyers. But there's no individual Congress member that has, monopoly on the information. So what interest groups do is they serve to educate even congressmen, because these interest groups, they're specialists, whereas congressmen, congresswomen, they tend to be a little bit more generalist. Now again, congressmen may have expertise on a particular area, and they may serve on a committee as such, but as a whole, the interest group probably has access to more data. Now the trick is, as an interest group, you're probably going to spin or skew your data to favor your own interests, but it is what it is. And interest groups, they do a lot of the work, and they have an incentive in trying to present information, again, that's usually favorable to them. But again, you have opposing interest groups that are doing the same. And it's the role of Congress to navigate between all the competing stacks of information. Now, what else do interest groups do? Well, they represent their membership. Again, they serve as this link between members and the government. We have a representative democracy rather than a direct democracy. So in a direct democracy, you can argue that interest groups, their role wouldn't be as important, but not many people I know, have the time to, voice their concerns to the government, lobby in front of Congress. So the interest groups, again, serves as this link between the public and the government. And again, what I kind of mentioned before as providing information, they officially provide information to the government, especially data and testimony in congressional committee hearings. So again, they serve as this link towards the government. And finally, what they do is they provide channels for political participation that enable citizens to work together to achieve a common goal. So without the role of interest groups, it'd probably be a little bit harder to get involved. With all the plethora of surface groups that are out there, individuals can kind of pick what cause they are passionate about, and they can get involved that way. Whereas if they individually had to lobby Congress, you can argue that there would just be too much of a barrier for an individual to get involved politically. So what kind of interest groups are there? Well, probably the primary one, people vote in terms of their pocketbook, and so it's probably going to fall under economic interest groups. So again, most interest groups fall under this category of economic interest groups. So labor groups like the AFL-CIO and the Teamsters Union, they protect the interests of organized labor. Very strong. Again, usually these interest groups are going to favor Democratic candidates, just because the Democratic Party is usually more aligned to the aligned to the goals of union members, whereas business groups, they promote business interests in general, such as the Chamber of Commerce of the United States and the National Association of Manufacturers. And just like how labor unions tend to support Democratic candidates, you're going to have these business interest groups. They're going to generally favor Republican candidates. Again, not 100% all the time, but that's the general rule of thumb as to where the interest groups are going to align themselves towards. And again, you have professional groups such as the National Education Association, the NEA, the American Medical Association, MAA, the American Bar Association, the ABA, and the National Farmers Union, which again, they're going to promote interests of their particular profession. So a lot of these individuals, they're going to generally congregate towards trying to serve their own economic interests. They're going to coalesce around their particular occupation to try to get the best benefits for that. So again, this is kind of the role of what these interest groups do. And people that work on behalf of these interest groups are called lobbyists. Again, they get a bad rap, but there certainly is a function for them in our system of government. Now, again, these are some other interest groups that are out there. It doesn't necessarily have to form around your profession. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, the National Rifle Association, or the NRA, Charlton Heston, who's passed away. He was probably, obviously maybe more famous for his acting, but he was a strong advocate of gun rights, and he was the basic spokesman for the NRA. The AARP, which was formerly called the American Association of Retired Persons, but now they're just known as AARP. So they basically represent the interests of senior citizens. You can pretty much guarantee that if there was a bill that raised the age limit for Social Security benefits, or if they hike the tax on Social Security, or if they lowered the benefits on Social Security, or they raised the age limits, you can rest assured that the AARP, they're going to mobilize its millions of members and do what it can do to take out the congressmen that voted against their interest in the next election. So the AARP, very strong interest group. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, they're going to have issues that promote its members as well. The National Council of Churches, bills or laws dealing with family issues, issues of faith. The American Jewish Congress, the League of Women Voters, And again, something like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There's just tons and tons of different interest groups. So if there's a cause that you're particularly interested in, chances are there's already an interest group out in Washington, D.C., and they do try to lobby Congress, and there's a lot of different competing interests, and it's really the job of congressmen to sort out, what's in the best interest of either himself, constituents, or the country. And again, that's kind of the things we're going to look on a little later on when we review Congress. So what are some interest group strategies? So we'll go ahead and number them first, and then I'll go back to what specifically they are. But they try to influence elections. They lobby. They oftentimes will use litigation, or they'll go public. Okay, so there are four different things. They'll either try to influence elections, lobby, use a court system, or again, they probably want to try to avoid this, but they'll go public with it as well. Influencing elections. Now, what do they do? Again, the major difference between interest groups and political parties is that political parties actually, they can control the government by electing members and getting candidates to run for office and basically control the government. Interest groups, they actually don't have candidates. So what they do is they try to identify the candidates that are favorable to their cause, and they can contribute money to them. They can create mechanisms that promote, or they support candidates that promote their agenda. So what they do is they encourage members who support their views. They campaign for and contribute money to candidates. And there are a lot of different websites where they create report cards. So certain interest groups will say, this candidate XYZ is going to align with our interests 98% of the time, and this other candidate will only align with our interests 10% of the time. So they'll create a report card. So the matter of how candidates for Congress voted, it's a matter of public record. So it's one thing to be able to rate incumbents. So they have a record which can work in their favor, but it can work against them as well if they decide to vote against certain interest groups that originally supported them. In terms of lobbying as well, interest groups, they attempt to influence policymakers by supplying data either directly or through grassroots lobbying or coalition lobbying. So again, they provide information to the members. What they do also is that they can use grassroots lobbying or coalition lobbying as well. So, whatever means that is kind of appropriate for interest groups to get their message across, they're going to try to do it. If that doesn't work, then they'll resort to litigation. So they can actually take the issues to court if they're unable to get support from Congress. But again, it's something that they probably want to avoid doing if they can directly lobby. That's why these interest groups, they'll make tons of contributions to congressmen. Usually it's not to buy the vote necessarily. It's generally to buy the influence. Again, you can argue both ways on whether or not this is something that's good for our democracy, but it is what it is, right? And one of the things that generally interest groups try to avoid is going public, especially with very specific issues. It's generally not worth it. Now, certain issues that may resonate with the public, they might want to use the media, but as a rule of thumb, interest groups generally like flying under the radar and getting support from Congress on issues that maybe the public might be too complicated of an issue, and so they want to kind of fly under the radar and get influence without getting too much publicity. But once in a while, they'll go public, and again, as a last resort, interest groups might appeal to the public for support using the media to highlight their agenda. But again, it's generally regarded as kind of the method of last resort. So what are political action committees? Political action committees kind of been a hot topic over the past however many years. But basically, federal law regulates political action committees. So in order to be a political action committee, you must officially register with the federal government, and you follow strict accounting rules. So it's heavily regulated by the government. Again, it can be for whatever political cause that you have. Individuals are limited to contributing $5,000 to political action committees. So you can donate money to a particular candidate, and if there's a political action committee that you feel strongly about, let's say it's a pro-life PAC or it's a pro-choice PAC, you can donate up to $5,000 to that PAC, per year. So that $5,000, so all the money that PACs receive from individuals, again with that maximum, PACs may contribute $5,000 to one candidate per election cycle. So if that candidate wins in the primary, then that PAC can also donate $5,000 in the general election. So basically $10,000 to a candidate if that candidate is successful in the primaries, or $15,000 to the political party in 1 year, or the PAC can donate that $5,000 to another PAC per year. So there are limits to the amount that individuals or PACs are regulated towards, but at the same time, these PACs, however, may make unlimited expenditures independently of a candidate or a party. So what's kind of interesting, you can donate this $5,000 to a PAC, $5,000 to ABC candidate, and at the same time, that PAC can use any of its money to support any candidate it wants. Again, as long as it's not coordinating with any other campaign or there's some kind of under the table arrangement, these PACs are able to do whatever they want to do. So the reason why that actually changed recently, the court case that changed that law was called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. So what happened that changed in that? Well, the Supreme Court, they overturned sections of the Campaign Reform Act of 2002, basically titled the McCain-Feingold Act, which again was kind of a bipartisan effort to reform campaign finance. Well, that law actually prohibited corporate and union political expenditures in campaigns. And again, some of the sections was actually overturned. Obviously, John McCain was not too happy about that, nor was Russ Feingold. But the Supreme Court looked at it and said, there are parts that they deemed to be unconstitutional. Kind of background behind that: there's a conservative lobbying group. It was called Citizens United. They wanted to air Hillary, the movie, which was very critical of then candidate Hillary Clinton. At that time, this was before Barack Obama gained momentum and eventually became the Democratic nominee. It was really assumed that Hillary Clinton would be the standard bearer for the Democrats in 2008, and so this conservative lobbying group during the primary season, they aired this on DirecTV, or they planned to air it, and the idea was that it violated campaign rules because it was considered to be just a direct attack on Hillary Clinton as a candidate, and it was deemed by the lower courts to be political in nature and therefore illegal. So again, this lower court, it held that it violated McCain-Feingold's restriction on TV broadcast within 30 days of the Democratic primaries. So the lower court said, no, you're not able to show that. The whole point of this pseudo documentary was to damage Hillary Clinton's chances in winning the Democratic nomination. So and again, so Hillary Clinton probably did not want that personally to be aired as well. But the Supreme Court, they ruled in, again, to show that the court was really divided along ideological lines. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 ruling, argued that it was unconstitutional to ban free speech through the limitation of independent communications by corporations, associations, and unions. Not only was it a very divided ruling on the Supreme Court, President Obama addressed in his State of the Union address how he disagreed with this ruling as well. So you can say that this is a testament to American democracy, that even though that there's disagreement on one ruling, there's still sense of rule of law, and there's respect for the Supreme Court as far as abiding by decisions that individuals don't necessarily agree with. Okay. Now, what this basically created was this Citizens United. It created this super PAC. So Citizens United, that decision, and basically Speech Now versus the FEC, which basically stipulated that PACs that did not make contributions to candidates, parties could accept unlimited contributions from individuals, unions, and corporations. So not only did it change the rules of PACs, it basically enabled creation of an informal term, super PAC. So it's actually officially referred to as Independent Expenditure Only Committee, or the term super PAC was coined by Eliza Carney at the National Journal. So whereas normal PACs or regular PACs will accept money and make contributions directly to candidates, and they're regulated by such. Again, Citizens United allowed unlimited contributions, but the amount of money that you're able to donate directly to candidates, it still remained the same. Well, the super PACs, as long as that PAC does not directly contribute to a candidate, now that super PAC is basically allowed to make as much independent expenditures as possible. So now there are some key rules that super PACs, they are not allowed to coordinate directly with candidates or political parties. So they can spend however much they want, and kind of a way around that, there's nothing against an individual candidate. Let's say in 2016, or let's say that Rand Paul is running, and a super PAC is created that says they can create whatever they want. Libertarian Republicans wanting to take back the government. Let's say that's a super PAC. Now, Rand Paul is permitted to speak out into the media saying that he wants so and so, and the super PAC can speak out into the media. And that's technically not considered coordinating. Coordinating campaign would be Rand Paul calling the super PAC and saying, I want ads directed to so-and-so and whatnot. So there are a lot of loopholes that the creation of super PACs have actually allowed. And again, 2012 was the first presidential election in which you had the effect of the Citizens United ruling, having major consequences. Now, again, the reality is that in 2012, most money given to super PACs came from wealthy individuals. You didn't have a lot of average working citizens donating money to super PACs. Chances are you're not seeing a lot of average individuals donating to candidates as well. But this provided another avenue for really wealthy candidates to kind of throw around their money. Now, again, you can argue that because it was, they're allowed to throw money to either candidate. Some of maybe the concerns that individuals had that, it would really unfairly impact the election process. A lot of it was probably overstated. The example of some Republican PACs that came about in 2012 was Restore Our Future, which was basically a Romney super PAC. Now, was it officially a Romney super PAC? Again, that would be illegal. But you had individuals that were connected with Mitt Romney, ex staff members, people that are very friendly to Romney. They're the ones that created this PAC. But again, there's another PAC that was called Winning Our Future, which was a PAC that was set up by, friends of Newt Gingrich. So, you're going to see that played out in future presidential elections. And so the role of money, individuals can't directly contribute more than X amount to a candidate, but you could create your own super PAC and you can spend $1 billion of your own money trying to get someone elected, which again has its pros and cons. And again, it should be interesting how this should play out into the future. So the mass media, let's go on to what the impact that the mass media has on the election process, and it serves as a linkage institution. Well, the mass media actually refers to all forms of communication that transmit information to the general public. And again, this is the the only linkage mechanism that specializes in communication. And again, examples include magazines, radio, television, and most recently the internet. The first president to effectively use mass media as a medium was Franklin Roosevelt with his fireside chats. And again, John F. Kennedy was very adept using the mass media, particularly using television. And you can argue that in the 1960 presidential election, it was his ability to use the mass media that got him elected to the presidency over Richard Nixon, who didn't have as much appeal on television. If you ask individuals who actually won the debate on TV, Richard Nixon was kind of sweating, and he wasn't quite a natural. He was fighting a little sickness. He wasn't able to effectively use the mass media, TV, as well as John F. Kennedy. Whereas individuals that heard on the radio, generally they viewed Richard Nixon as being the winner of the 1960 presidential debate. So again, the use of mass media is a huge huge component in government, particularly the presidency. Now, what are the roles that the media uses? So include the following: they inform the public and shape public opinion. And again, they provide this link between the government and citizens. So they are a linkage mechanism. And again, they serve as a watchdog that investigates politicians. For example, Gary Hart in 1984. In 1984, there are rumors that are circulating around that Gary Hart, then a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, who eventually lost to Walter Mondale, well, there are rumors that he was having an extramarital affair. And so to try to squash the rumors, Gary Hart went to the media and he said, this is outrageous. I challenge the media to see if they can find any type of evidence of wrongdoing on my part. Well, you know what? If it is the case, then there's nothing wrong with challenging the media if there was no hint of impropriety. But the fact was that Gary Hart was actually having an affair, and there were pictures. The media took him up on the challenge, and there are pictures of him and another woman, that really linked him to an affair. And again, that wasn't necessarily the only reason, but that was the primary reason why Gary Hart exited the primaries. So they do serve as this watchdog of sort. In 2008, something very similar happened, although John Edwards, who was basically the third candidate, placed third behind Obama and Clinton, the media as a watchdog actually caught him in a lot of similar situations as Gary Hart, but in addition to that, using campaign funds inappropriately. So the media, they do serve as this watchdog to make sure that the politicians are trying to be honest, or at least appearing to be honest. And again, they serve as a gatekeeper by setting the agenda to determine what is or what is not important. For example, the Vietnam War protests in the early 70s, obviously the government didn't want that to be kind of the big issue, the overriding issue, but the media, they basically determined this is the big issue of the day, and then it did become a big issue. So these medias as gatekeepers. Now, what does that actually mean here? Media executive, news editors, and prominent reporters, they dictate what gets news coverage. So if there's something that might be newsworthy to particular individuals, but it's not perceived to be newsworthy by the powers that be, then the issue doesn't get covered, and therefore it doesn't become a big issue. Unlike in publicly owned media in most other countries in which the government is basically the controller of the media, media are basically private companies in the U.S. that rely on profit. So you have public entities outside the United States for the most part. In the United States, this might be a significant political issue, but if people aren't going to watch your news or read your news or listen to your news, then it begs the question on whether or not that news story is actually going to be out there. So because we live in the United States, where, profit is a huge incentive of media companies, the type of news coverage that is out there, might not be for the purest interest, so to speak. So as a result, in political coverage, we get a lot of horse race journalism that tends to dominate over substantive policy issue differences. So that's something that you might want to make sure you understand the concept of, because it definitely has been on AP exam in terms of what type of issues does the media cover, and horse race journalism is up there. So rather than finding the specific policy differences on Obama and Romney regarding foreign affairs, that's really not going to get as much coverage as what is Florida, what are the polls in Florida, who's leading between Obama and Romney. So a complaint that some individuals have is that news coverage isn't getting what candidates stand for in terms of public policy, partly because that doesn't get coverage. So a lot of the coverage is going to be on this horse race journalism, who's winning, because individuals might watch when you see who the winner is or who the leader is in a particular state, rather than finding the details of foreign policy, which might be a little bit too cumbersome for the general public. So again, the way that the media works, it's kind of relying on profit and what's gonna get people to kind of watch you. And again, politicians, they kind of work that angle. You can't really blame them, and so they're gonna do whatever they can to try to appeal. They're gonna try to play to the media. That's generally a prerequisite. And one of the modern things, at least in the United States, is that it's becoming almost a requirement, again, an informal requirement, of course, for presidential candidates to appear on Saturday Night Live. John McCain actually hosted Saturday Night Live after his initial loss in the 2000 primaries to George W. Bush. So again, this happened a couple of years before he ran for office in 2004. But I remember there's actually a funny skit where John McCain was on, and he was asked whether or not he would challenge George Bush in the primaries, and in 2000, and there was kind of a lot of laughter on whether or not if George W. Bush would, if he forgot to run for re-election in the year 2004, would John McCain challenge him in the primaries. So it was a sketch with Tim Russert, and John McCain basically, he didn't have the best relationship with then President Bush, but he was a loyal Republican. He said that he would pick up the phone and call George Bush and remind him to run for re-election. And then in 2008, would he run again? And John McCain actually incorrectly said no. In 2012, 2016, 2020, or 2024, would John McCain run against a reanimated zombie of Jimmy Carter? And again, the answer to that was no. But, John McCain, even though he said he wouldn't run, you can argue that the only reason he went on Saturday Night Live was that he was considering the bid for the presidency in 2004, and he was using the media to really soften his image. And, apparently it worked. The media liked John McCain, the Straight Talk Express, and that's an example of what's required in order to become president of the United States. You have to be likable, and that's a huge characteristic. Again, to a lesser extent, George Bush and Al Gore, they were on Saturday Night Live. They were only there for like an opening sketch where they both agreed to appear and open the show. So George W. Bush and Al Gore, they both appeared in the opening sketch in 2000, and they made fun of themselves. George Bush wasn't known for being the best pronouncer of words. And Al Gore was kind of known as being kind of boring and sighing a lot, saying, well, I would put in what I call a lockbox. And George Bush, they kind of make fun of George Bush, kind of smirking all the time. But, again, as a politician, you realize that you kind of have to roll with what the media is giving you. And so it's becoming a prerequisite. Now, again, Obama appeared in a Halloween skit in 2007. He also opened up Monday Night Football in 2007 as well. So again, little things like that. The media, they act as gatekeepers and And presidential candidates, in order to become president, they have to use the media to their advantage if they want to get elected to office. So the media and the president. So how does it work with the media and the president of the United States? Well, Washington, D.C., they have the largest press corps of any city in the United States, of which a third are assigned to the president. Now, again, in today's day and age where there's a lot of decentralization, a lot of newspapers where they're not, covering maybe the president, they can't devote as many reporters, specifically towards the president. So that percentage might be dropping as the years go on. But the president, there's definitely a lot of coverage coming out of a lot of news that's being reported out of the White House. So newspapers generally assign reporters to just the president of the United States. Now, access to the president usually goes through the office of the press secretary. And so the president disseminates information to the press secretary, and the press secretary in turn disseminates information to the public. Now, does the president give all the information to the press secretary? Probably not. But if the president doesn't give enough information, then again, the media, they're going to be hungry for information as well. So it really is dependent on what the president is comfortable with the press secretary in terms of giving information. And again, different press secretaries are going to have different views on how to handle the media. Now, some ways that officials can leak information, and again, sometimes this happens, this happens against the wishes of the president's office, or sometimes the president's office specifically disseminates this information. So, but it is true that information gets distributed through different channels. On the record means that an individual or administration official is actually quoted by name. So you're on the record as saying that. Now, if information is given off the record, then what the official says can't be printed. Journalists will kind of abide by that code. Now, have journalists ever taken what's off of the record and actually, put that in an article? You can argue yes, but that journalist is probably going to be burning the bridge with that particular administration official. Or if something is said to be assumed off the record but isn't off the record, then journalists, it's up to them to figure out whether or not they're going to go public with the information or not. On background, that's one way to get the information out, but without it being directly attributed to you. So it may be printed but not attributed to any official. Now, another way is on deep background, and a lot of people don't like this because you don't know where the source came from at all, just that it came, but it may be printed but attributed anonymously. So there are different ways that the media can get information on the record, off the record, on background, on deep background. And again, sometimes the administration purposely does it, and sometimes it comes unauthorized. So media bias, is there anything that exists that there's media bias? Well, media critics will contend that the media absolutely are biased in reporting, and that reporters have this liberal bias. So the idea, and it's actually true. Reporters generally won't deny that. Most people that enter the journalism profession, they'll tend to have a little bit more of a liberal than conservative bias. But there are conservative media outlets out there that include Fox, Wall Street Journal, and maybe the Drudge Report. So, these companies, these websites, these newspapers, they're out there to cater more towards these conservatives. So conservatives will generally tune in to, what confirms their particular bias. At the same time, there are liberal media outlets that include MSNBC and the New York Times, and, people will tune in. Now, as a general rule of thumb, conservative talk radio or conservative cable outlets, they will generally actually have much higher ratings than liberal cable outlets or liberal radio stations, which again kind of might give you an idea of where where the audience is. I mean, if there was more of an audience for liberal TV shows, I'm sure it would there would be more availability of it. But the fact that news shows that are on Fox, Hannity, these conservative news shows, they'll generally have higher ratings than things that are that are on MSNBC, such as the Rachel Maddow. You're going to see conservative news outlets actually have slightly higher ratings. But again, it's usually not that they're going to influence voters as much. It's just voters tend to watch things that confirm their own individual biases. And the media, they're in it for profit as well. So they're going to churn out shows that kind of go along with that bias. Now, what are some neutral news organizations? Well, CNN, again, depending on your point of view, might be considered neutral. They try to present the news objectively, but there are some critics of CNN during the Clinton administration that nicknamed CNN as the Clinton News Network. So this is the idea that when tried to portray things objectively, some people argue there might be a liberal media bias to it. One network out there that actually does try to be biased in the way they report things is C-SPAN, or the Cable Satellite Public Affairs Network, and C-SPAN 2. So C-SPAN actually covers mostly what's going on in the House of Representatives. There's no commentary. They try to make everything objective and as neutral as possible. C-SPAN 2 covers the Senate. And, when there are presidential debates, whereas a lot of these news outlets are going to have reporters and analysts and have all these different things, C-SPAN usually tends to stray away from that, and they just present the speech. They'll have call-in radio shows or the call-in shows, but they're not going to interject, or they try their best not to interject their own individual biases on there. Again, these two networks are actually created to increase coverage of Congress in an unbiased format, again, usually without interjecting any political commentary one way or another. So again, can't do that 100% of the time, but that's the intent of C-SPAN. So example number 1, let's take a look at some example questions to highlight the role of interest groups in media. Which of the following is not a function of an interest group? So what are things that interest groups do, and what are things that they don't do? Okay, do they raise awareness and stimulate interest in public affairs? Absolutely, they do. So let's cross it out, because that's not the answer. Do they serve as a link between members and government? Absolutely, that's a role of interest groups as a linkage institution. So B is incorrect, because it is true. Do they provide specialized information to members of Congress? Absolutely. The role of interest groups, they are specialists, whereas Congress, they tend to be generalists. Do they provide a channel for public political participation for the achievement of common goals? Absolutely. So that is incorrect. So A, B, C, and D, they are functions of interest groups. So if you ever get an FRQ question, what role do interest groups play in our U.S. government? Well, one, they raise awareness that stimulate interest in public affairs. They serve as a link between members and the government. They provide specialized information to members of Congress by lobbying for the interests of their members. And they provide an avenue for public participation for the achievement of common goals. So those would be 4 different roles of interest groups. What they do not do, they do not really represent a broad range of interests. So that would be the correct answer. Now, could they represent more than one interest? Yes, obviously, it's not going to be exclusively narrow all the time, but generally speaking, interest groups are for the interests of one group of people rather than a broad range of interests. Okay, example number 2, a method of lobbying by which interest group members and others outside the organization, they write letters, they send telegrams, and make telephone calls to influence policymakers is called which of the following? So is it litigation lobbying? Is it litigation lobbying? No. Is it grassroots lobbying? Yeah, that is the correct answer, so we'll just circle it here. That's not direct lobbying. That's where you specifically go to Congress members to lobby directly. It's not coalition lobbying, and it's not influential. So grassroots lobbying, they have their purpose, using support from its members to try to get information or to try to get favorable legislation passed. Example number 3, who was the first American president to use radio as a form of mass media in communicating with the American public? So basically the president, they have the bully pulpit, and with the prevalence of mass media in the 20th century, it was Franklin Roosevelt that individually became the first president to effectively use the radio as a form of mass media communication through his fireside chats. It wasn't John Fitzgerald Kennedy, not William Jefferson Clinton, not Harry S. Truman, and not George Herbert Walker Bush, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And example number 4, what is the difference between a PAC and a super PAC? So you have a political action committee, and what is this super political action committee? Well, let's eliminate the ones that are incorrect here. Let's take a look at the first one. PACs may not air political advertisements 30 days before an election. Super PACs may do so. This is incorrect. Now, if this was before 2010, the first part is correct, but super PACs didn't exist after 2000 or before 2010, so this is incorrect. They can air 30 days before an election. There's no limits on what PACs may or may not do. Super PACs may not air political advertisements 30 days before an election. PACs may do so. Again, this is incorrect. Both PACs and super PACs, they may air political advertisements. Yeah. The Citizens United versus FEC decision banned the creation of super PACs. It's actually the opposite. The decision basically paved the way for the creation of super PACs, because now individuals or independent expenditure-only PACs, they are able to contribute unlimited amounts to the PAC, again, as long as they're not contributing directly to the campaign. It's an independent-only expenditure PAC. PACs may contribute contributions to candidate campaigns. Super PACs, as independent expenditure-only committees, may not contribute directly to candidates, and that is absolutely correct. Super PACs, they can do their own thing, but they cannot directly donate money to any candidates, but they can independently do their own thing. And there is no difference between PACs and super PACs. That is wrong. There absolutely is a difference between PACs and super PACs. So again, with Citizens United, the rules of how PACs are governed changed pretty significantly. Thank you for watching educator.com.